Wow. Good morning. It is lovely to see some familiar faces out there and some new ones. I am Lauren Pettigrew. I'm the COO at the Leadership Sphere. And I know we're gathering virtually today from multiple countries, but before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Australian land where we meet today. I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and anyone with us today. We're going to be together until 10:30, if you can stick around. You are going to receive a quick intro from me and an outro. There will be a Q&A session at the end, and there will be a survey. Now, feedback is the breakfast of champions. Sometimes you need to check who's cooking, but we would really value your feedback. So the survey will come in the link at the end. So please fill that in for us and in the email afterwards. Majority of the day is going to be content from our CEO and founder, Phillip Ralph. Good morning, Phil.
Good morning, Lauren. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you. And Chris Taylor, who is joining us from Canada. So I believe good evening, Chris.
Good evening indeed. Great to see everyone. Good morning.
Thank you. So most of the session is going to be these two. I'm going to do a little bit of quick housekeeping this morning. So just by turning up, you're eligible to win a prize. It is not a set of Ginzu steak knives, but we have got some pretty cool stuff. We've got a $10,000 one-to-one coaching package. We have got 2 signed copies of Atomic Habits, signed by James Clear, not us. It's a bit cooler than that. So we've got those, and we've also got a spot worth about $2.5 grand in our Dare to Lead public program to give out some small prizes. Please engage, please use the chat box and interact with us to be eligible, and just by turning up. Now, if you are not eligible for prizes, you might need to get a new job. No, just kidding. Sorry. Please type a message Sarah Hay in the chat box and just let her know. I know some people can't receive gifts or awesome prizes, so please let Sarah know. We will send an email out this afternoon with announcing those 4 winners. A little bit more housekeeping. Please do stay on mute, but speak up if you'd like. But while you're not contributing or talking, please leave yourself on mute. If you're comfortable, please leave your cameras on. So I went to a presentation, and on Teams, the video didn't start, and I couldn't see the 10 people in the boardroom. So I didn't know if my jokes were funny. I didn't know if someone was about to talk, and I felt really quite blind. So let's give our facilitators or presenters today a bit of visibility on your faces to see if you think they're funny or giving good content. So if you could leave your cameras on, only if you're comfortable to do so. So before I hand over, who has been to training or organized training or a development session that was actually pretty good? The session was good, but then people walked away and nothing happened, right? There's a lot of nodding. It is the bane of our existence. It is the passion of these 2 CEOs and founders that they've been battling out in the industry. We don't want to waste people's time or energy or effort or money. If nothing's going to shift, there's no point in doing these sessions. So without further ado, Phillip Ralph, I'm going to hand over. He's going to talk to you a little bit about the Leadership Sphere and introduce himself. And so Chris will take you through some content. And if you've got questions during the session, please pop them in the chat box, and I'll keep an eye on them and bring them up in the Q&A at the end. Phillip?
Thanks, Lauren. Why don't you go first, Chris? Over to you.
Oh, sure. All right, great. I was just about to spotlight you too, Phil. So let me spotlight myself. Hi, my name is Chris. I'm in Toronto, Canada. As Lauren very aptly pointed out, I've been borderline obsessed. My wife would scratch borderline, but honestly, really obsessed with the really simple concept of how do we take ideas and turn them into behavior change. Basically, I've done it, we've all done it, where you read a great book, you watch a show, you hear a talk, you attend something like this, and you go, oh, that's a great idea. And then it goes away. And so about 16 years ago, I started this company called Actionable. Our focus has been maniacally focused on that, which is how do we help training companies, facilitators, corporate change initiatives turn the ideas that are being shared with an audience into lasting behavior change, and then how do we measure it? I love this stuff. I love the people we get to work with. They tend to be forward-thinking folks like the TLS group. And aside from that, I have 2 young kids who are a ton of fun, and my wife, who is even more fun when we get a chance to see each other. So that's me.
Very good. Thanks, Chris. did you want to talk to these at all, or?
Oh, sure. I can give a little bit of a, yeah. So what Actionable is, as a company, as a product, we have really three arms. Learning and development departments, change groups, and consulting firms use these three on predefined and existing programs. The habit builder helps participants turn ideas, inspiration in the room, in the sessions they're in, into lasting behavior change by supporting them with nudges and social reinforcement. Actionable Conversations is a vehicle for leaders and their teams to revisit concepts that they may have heard but haven't yet really internalized. So how to have that conversation and drive change. And then Actionable Insights is a way to connect the behavior change that's taking place to the organizational priorities. Basically, can we show that the behaviors that are shifting are the right behaviors, the ones that actually matter to the business and are moving the needle on internal KPIs? We'll go through pieces of this, but the real focus here is to give you some practical tools that you can apply to your own systems and your own programs running forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. And we've known each other for about 8 years and yeah, partnered in this space. It's so important. So yeah, good morning again, everyone. This topic is really important. It's one of those ones that, you know, kind of keeps consultants awake at night, and HR consultants and people in culture is how do we actually transfer what we know, our knowledge and our insights into action that makes a difference for the business. So I've been in this field for 3 decades now, and right across a whole range of different industries, including Victoria Police, where I was, yeah, training and development, health and wellness, operational for some time. I was in policy and education for some time, but really, I guess was my foundation for learning and development. And I fell in love with learning and development. I was in the psychology unit for 5 years, worked with a whole range of different, both internal, external. So it's an area that I'm really super passionate about. Went to ANZ for 6 years and again, really extended my knowledge and thinking around learning and development kind of with a global organization, if you like. And then for the last 17 years, we had our 17th birthday on the 2nd of April. So we're kind of just moving out of the teenage years and hopefully starting to mature. But yeah, we've been around for a fairly long period of time, I guess. And for me, you know, our passion is to really create insight with impact. And I think that's the most important thing. So in terms of what we're going to be covering today, we have a really rich agenda, I think, where there'll be periods where we can definitely pause for conversation and questions. We will be using the chat box. We want to make it as interactive as possible as Chris and I navigate this fascinating, really challenging, but interesting topic. So we'll be looking at emerging trends in learning and development, how to measure learning impact, you know, that old chestnut, how to make learning stick, and then how to sustain and cascade learning impact, which I think will be fantastic. Okay, so global trends. We're going to use the chat box as I was just referencing a moment ago. I'd love for you to think about what are you seeing, you know, worldwide? What are the big things that you're seeing globally that are impacting organizations? And also, what are the things that you're seeing in your maybe in your own organization or those organizations you're working with? So in the chat box, what are the things that you're really seeing in terms of trends organizationally and globally? Just pop in the chat box. Thanks, Lindsay. AI, absolutely. Tailored learning. Thanks, Catherine. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces too, by the way. Disconnected workforces, absolutely. Brian. Demands for sustainability.
Anything else?
We've got 5 responses. If everyone could put something in, it would be awesome. Building connection. Bespoke programs. Thanks, Sasha. Move towards micro learning. Absolutely. Policy gaps with AI, rapid change, remote working, inclusive thinking, collaboration, not clear direction, just in time micro learning. Excellent.
No, these are really good.
Social skills. Sorry, what was that, Chris?
So these are really good. There's a nice, nice mix in there.
Volume EQ, mental health. Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the ones that we're picking up as well. So really appreciate the contribution there. So some of the trends at the macro level is this global insecurity, and we've seen this play out unfortunately just recently again, more locally, supply issues, inflation, scarce, expensive talent, flexible working, remote and hybrid models. We're still hearing a lot from that as employers are still trying to get people back into the workplace. I heard a really nice distinction recently that let's let people work from home to do their work, but maybe come in, one day a week to connect with other people, rather than when people come into work, a lot of teams we work with are saying, well, then we're just on Zoom or Teams calls anyway. So what's the point of coming into the office? So I think this is still an ongoing challenge for people. Mutual mistrust. So, some of the data that's coming out around trust between employer and employee, and I'll talk about some of those figures shortly, is a little bit, surprising and compelling for us to really do something different, I think. Being able to right size. So these are not particularly new trends, but they feel like they're amplifying and getting even more important in recent times. We know that managers are really the linchpin of organizational success, and yet many managers are disengaged and feeling overwhelmed and overworked. A Gartner report recently suggested that 54% of managers were really suffering from burnout. Microsoft Trends report in late in 2023 said globally something like 54% of people reported being burnt out. So there's something in organizations that we're doing that we really need to kind of rewire, rethink, and remaster how we engage in employment and how we show up as managers. Focus more moving towards human-centric leaders. Maybe that's more of a wish than a trend, but I think the tide is very, very slowly turning to focus more on people rather than things and processes and tasks. ESG has been around for a long time, but I feel like some major corporate, mishaps of recent times is really bringing ESG to the fore, as is hopefully diversity, equity, and inclusion is becoming more and more important, moving beyond just being, a glossy brochure in the strategic plan. How do we actually really do that more importantly? AI, as some mentioned, is really important. And how do we measure the stickiness, which is what today's really about, the impact and stickiness of L&D? So what around that? So some areas are contracting, although in Australia, some of the economic reports coming out are looking much more buoyant and optimistic. Development for the masses. So some large organizations are saying, how do we develop more people more cheaply? So just in time, as someone mentioned in the chat box, and really moving to not just a very narrow band of development, but how do we develop more people horizontally? I think is something really useful to talk about. How does HR and managers support this rewiring? I'm working with a team at the moment, and this is a generalized experience, but one particular team, and they're just exhausted. They're absolutely exhausted, and they're way over capacity. And some of the research I've said that the average manager has around 50% more on their plate than they actually have time in the available. So, we kind of need to rethink this whole role of management and what does it really mean to be a manager and a leader in organizations. Build connected cultures. So back to the remote working and hybrid working, how do we build that human interaction and connection for people? Fatigue management and well-being, as I said, is the so what of some of the trends we're seeing. Change leadership in a different way. How do we actually really lead change in a really effective way rather than just recycle old ways of leading change? Need to restructure the end-to-end learning. So how do we think about it in a much more holistic way, not episodic, or how do we make learning stick and just think about what happens after the workshop, but also think about before, during, and after, for example. Moving away from some of the old models that aren't necessarily evidence-based, and how do we think in a much more contemporary way, which takes into account human factors. And then prove impact at various levels, which is a theme today. So So there's some of the things we're seeing. I think hopefully sets a nice foundation and context for us to really engage in this conversation today with you. So Chris, over to you.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks. I think that list back. Can you put that list back up for a second?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'd just be curious from the folks in the in the group here today, if you're looking at that list, particularly the what, if appreciating most people commented before, but is there one or two of those on that list that stands out to you in particular as being most important for you and your organization? You can just drop it in the chat if there is. I have this urge to scribble on the screen and write in numbers. They can comment the numbers. Make training stick, says Alex. Human-centric leaders, says Amy. Pressures to do more with less. Daniel's experiencing diversity and inclusion. Awesome. Well-being and burnout, prove impact. This is interesting, right? Because there's a real mix in here. Although everyone now coming in with burnout and well-being. So maybe I spoke too soon. The leader manager role. This is really good. I'm always curious. We've got the global trends and sort of the macro trends, and then you've got a group of humans like this group that are proactively using their time to advance this field. And I'm always curious sort of where that focus lies compared to the global. This is cool. Thanks. Thanks for humoring me. All right, we can go. There we go. So let's do this one then too. So this, or maybe Maria already started. What are the challenges that you face in measuring learning impact? What are you experiencing? Maybe you haven't thought about it. Bottom line. How does it impact the bottom line? Absolutely. That's what the executive team cares about. 100%, right? That's their job, is to care about that. What else? What are some of the challenges that you face in measuring learning impact? How's it going to improve productivity, right? What's the impact going to be? Teams are constantly changing. It's that game of whack-a-mole. You just develop this group, except none of the people there are the same as they were, a year ago. At the outset, being really clear what outcome clients want. Yep, culture's changing, totally. Retention of these skills, understanding people's takeaways and application, speed of change. So we've got a mix in there, which is great. And I think they fall, thankfully, into the three buckets that I'm going to speak to. I pulled up a Brandon Hall group learning measurement study where they were talking to senior L&D HR folks in regards to this exact question. 42% of them, we don't have the proper metrics. 42% of them, we don't have the time or staff. 36%, we don't have the technology. 35%, it's too difficult to link learning to outcomes. 31%, it's too difficult to assess. Only 9% said we don't see a need. And so this is what the impetus for Actionable was there's a need, there's blockers, and not a clear path to moving forward with that. So Phil, if you want to pull up the next slide there. Thank you. So the slide was up earlier, but we've been doing this in this format for about 11 years. Over that period of time, we've worked on about 6,000 programs across now about 1,200 client organizations in partnership with about 400 consulting firms. We've had literally hundreds of thousands of participants in learning programs and change programs utilize elements of the Actionable system. And so we have this really rich data set around what works and what doesn't in consistently driving change. And so that's part of what I want to share with you today. But when we think about how to actually measure change, how to link impact, there's ultimately three areas that we've found organizations need. And the first one is learning momentum. We need to know that most people that are in the training session are going to take something from the session and attempt to put it into practice. We need that momentum propelled beyond the end of the session back into the workplace. So we need a system for that. We also need to have visibility around that, because while 360s are great and have their place, and performance reviews, et cetera, are good again and have their place, they're all lagging indicators. When someone leaves the session, usually for the 2 or 3 or 4 weeks following, we have very little to no visibility into what change is actually happening. So we need to make it visible so that we have a shared understanding of where change is taking place. And then the last piece that we need is strategic relevance. We need to know that the changes that are taking place are changes that are in alignment with the strategic priorities of the organization. And so where we're going to go on the actionable portion of this journey is giving you tools to actually navigate those three pieces. So you can be thinking about how to bring that into your work. Again, I'm the Q&A guy. I am curious, learning momentum, visible change, strategic relevance, which is most interesting to you? Which one makes you go, yeah, I would like to know more about that? Visible change. Amy, you're the fastest typer in the West. Visible change, okay. Learning momentum, visible change. Awesome. Strategic relevance, the why, strategic relevance. I like how this is coming out in waves. Okay, cool. So we've got a nice mix in here, which is great because we're going to hit all three. I just wanted to know if we were going to disproportionately layer that in, but I think we're good. So Phil, let's go on to the how to measure. So we're going to go a little bit in reverse on that. So we're going to start with the strategic relevance. Then we're going to go to visible change. Is that true? Anyway, we'll give you signposts as we go. Okay. In the chat, just yes or no, who's familiar with the Kirkpatrick-Phillips model of evaluating training impact? Yes. Now, okay, so for those brave souls who said no, it's fascinating. People either really know it or they've never heard of it. It's like, doesn't seem to be any in between. So these two guys, Don Kirkpatrick and Jack Phillips, about 30 years apart, came to their own approach to how you would measure the ROI of training, effectively, the efficacy of training. And they're very complementary models, so they actually merged the two models and turned it into this. And it's a fairly straightforward and logical process. It basically says that as we're measuring the impact of training, as you move from level 1 to level 5, you increase the strategic relevance of that rating. So participant satisfaction, the happy sheets, right, after a session, do people like it? What did they learn? Was it too hot? Were the sandwiches okay? Being a little facetious. It's important, right? We know that there's lots of good science around the fact that when we're happily engaged in an activity, we're more likely to make change happen. But that's our base level measurement. The next level up, knowledge retention, is coming back and doing surveys post-session around how much do they remember from the session. The Association of Training and Development in the US did a survey last year, 2 years ago, that found that 16%, so it's the inverse, 84% of training measurements stopped at level 2. The vast majority of organizations and programs are stopping at knowledge retention, which makes sense. This is historically the HR purview, right? This is aside from completion metrics like attendance, these are the ways that we've measured the value of training in the HR function. But but this level around behavior change is where we actually bridge from what historically HR has measured and what typically the senior leadership team is looking for. The executive team, right? Their job is to ensure that they're making good bets as an organization, a good bet being one that generates more than it costs, right? Whether that's an asset or revenue or decreased costs. And so the focus is on ROI. ROI is typically going to be measured through KPIs before we get to actual money, and that's the business impact. So Phil, if you get, perfect. The behavior change layer helps us get from what happened to what is happening and what is that impact likely to be. So we want to measure behavior change in order to be a bridge between what's happening for participants and what the executive team typically cares about. Does that make sense for everybody? Yeah, Louise nodding vigorously, so okay. Enthusiastic support, kinda, says Maria. Okay, perfect. I'll just give one quick recap of this because I appreciate I'm Canadian and I speak quickly. The participant satisfaction, knowledge retention is where most training programs stop their measurement. The business impact, return on investment, is where HR and L&D, or sorry, not HR, where executive teams want to see a return. When they get reports from marketing or from manufacturing or from operations or from safety, it's around these things, right? It's around the business impact. In other words, the KPIs. because the KPIs have been well thought out to say these KPIs mean that we're going to have strong financial success if we're achieving the right targets. The problem with measuring training efficacy historically is that we have not had the opportunity to show it in the lens of what the executive team's typically looking for. So how do we do this? If you go to the next slide there, Phil. This is going to sound overly simplistic. And if you feel like you've gone down this path before, I'd encourage you to, as much as you're able, to revisit this with open eyes and sort of open mind and fresh eyes, because of the ability to measure behavior change. So what is this? The organization has strategic priorities. Like I said, super pedantic here. The organization has strategic priorities. We assume that those strategic priorities are things that haven't been achieved before. If they haven't been achieved before, then they're going to require new competencies. They're going to require people to act in new ways. And the organization, again, in a very simplistic lens here for a second, really has two paths then. If we need people inside the organization to be acting in new ways, we can either buy that, i.e. hire new talent, or we can build that, i.e. develop our people. And if the organization has chosen to develop their people, at least in part, then there are certain behavioral shifts that the individuals need to make in order to live that new competency. And the content that we're delivering as part of the training program should be in service to the behaviors that we're trying to drive. And Phil, I know you and I have talked about this back and forth for years, and the number of sort of training programs out there that are, here's some great content, let's go deliver it, as opposed to sort of this direction. I'm curious to get your thoughts on what you're experiencing on these pieces.
Yeah, that's right. It's often disconnected to, as you say, the organizational priorities. And when we receive a briefing, it's often about the content and stops there. And people are sometimes surprised when we ask
to Morgan Wallen.
What are the outcomes we're actually seeking. So
Super fan.
Yes. We might just mute people.
Yeah, I got it. Yep.
Yeah. Sorry, that's a very short answer to your question, but yeah, I think it's to extend our thinking into strategic priorities, and ultimately the strategy is really useful, and work backwards from that, right? The content level.
One of the easiest and most productive ways we've seen to bridge this, so whether you're on the receiving end or if you are asking a vendor for a program, is to ask the question in a shared space of, what are we trying to do here? Is the purpose to expose people to new information? If we have to choose one, is it to expose people to new information, or are we actually trying to drive change? And it's not meant to be facetious, because there are absolutely times where it's not about behavior change. It's about the experience. It's about recognition. It can be the antidote to burnout, to have sort of that space and time. But most of the time it's around change. And if we're asking the question of, what are we trying to do here? Are we deploying content, or are we driving change? When the unanimous decision is, yes, we're driving change, say, great, what kind of change and why does that matter? There's a sort of more fulsome set of questions that we can work through, but what does that look like? What are the behavioral changes we're trying to drive? And then how is that going to impact the business? That's if we're designing from sort of right to left. If we're designing from left to right, it's what are the competencies we're trying to develop? What are the behavioral elements of that? And what content is going to most efficiently and effectively encourage that behavior change?
I think just on that, Chris, one of the problems I think is organizations often aren't clear about their strategic priorities either. Again, they have a strategic plan, but there's no connection between the strategic plan, what people do on a day-to-day basis. So I think one of the challenges for organizations is to get clear about that, because we know there's global research around strategy, and 80% of CEOs are happy with the strategy but dissatisfied with the implementation. And so how do you bridge that gap is one of the keys, I think. Yeah.
I love the dream of this, just not how it's turning out in reality.
Correct.
That's good.
That's
great. Really good. Yeah, and again, I appreciate that I'm sort of dancing on the very surface here, this can absolutely be done. There was I'll give you a quick story. There was a casino that we were working with, this was a couple of years ago, where they had a fairly substantial turnover issue and flat culture, and they were trying to become a best employer in the region for their space, and that was part of their strategy because they were worried about talent shortages, etc. They'd identified the frontline leaders as being a key lever on that, and there's obviously a lot of different frontline leadership programs out there. What they chose to do instead of hiring for content is they hired a consulting firm who specialized in behavior change and had a great library of content. But they worked with that consultant to say, what are the specific behaviors that we believe we need to shift here? And, there's sort of, they did various surveys, etc. But it was pretty common, fair stuff, right? It was, we need better delegation, we need better accountability, we need better empathy, better compassionate connection. And so identifying the behaviors first that they wanted to shift on allowed them to identify the content that they were going to share. And then I'm going to get into some of the measurement stuff later on, so I can sort of park that story for now. But they could have gone to someone with a pre-packed, here's a program around frontline leadership. Instead, they went to, what are the behaviors that we need, and let's find the right system to deploy those.
There's a couple of great comments too there, Chris. I'm just noticing, so from Maria and Brian, around a lot of the strategic priorities are actually about, the financial metrics. So the performance piece, not about the health, right? So we see that a lot. Organizations want to improve performance, so they focus on performance and forget about what we call the healthy part, right? Which is all about leadership and culture and behavior change. So the enablers, as Brian said, so great point. Thanks, Brian.
And we have found that we can lament that as sort of people-centric organizations. And I've beat that drum for a long time as well, as you know. And the more we can speak in CEO, managing director language, right, the more we're going to get sort of a seat at the table and resources to deploy there. So I think there's an element of, or at least in my experience, those who can shift the languaging and position of the impact of their work to be in alignment with what the executive is already looking for is more likely to secure the budget, to do the people development work, right, and to have that positive impact.
I think sometimes as consultants, we're guilty of having a content-driven conversation, right, rather than a strategic-driven.
Yep.
Yeah, that's our comfort zone.
100%. All right, I feel like we could talk about this forever, so we can come back to it as well. But yeah, go ahead.
Excellent. So let's dive into behavior design just quickly before, as a bridge to something else that Chris is going to cover. But I think it's really useful when we're thinking about ourselves, whether it be a New Year's Eve resolution or something, more substantial potentially in an organizational context, is just being able to understand the difference and discern that between aspiration, which is a desire for something, be a better leader, for example, versus an outcome, which might be a specific capability or skill. And being able to talk at those two levels can be really useful. So therefore, what's the behavior that we need to create the outcome? And then ultimately the aspiration, which is a longer term vision of ourselves, whether it be better leader, better team, better, client-focused organization, or whatever that might be for people. And sometimes I think we select the wrong behaviors, or behaviors which are really hard to actually change. So, I like this really simple model by BJ Fogg from his book, Tiny Habits, around high impact and high feasibility is where we really should be starting, and what he calls golden behaviors. So what are the things that have, least resistance and we can do most readily in an organizational context to help move the dial on things rather than things that are really hard? And so how do we also normalize those behaviors in organizations? That's not enough though. So we need to, in order, as Chris has been talking about, to create meaningful change, we need more than simply just identifying the behaviors. And I think one of the things hopefully we'll really cover very well today is about context and how important that is to think more holistically. So if you want to pick it up there, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think I love Lindsay's question in the chat here, and I said we come back to it later. Now is later, because this is such a great transition. You know, as Phil's suggesting in here, well, let me just take a step back. I was just talking at 100,000 foot theoretical level, really, right? Around strategic priorities and competencies and behaviors and content. You're like, okay, great. In theory, what does it actually look like in practice? And this piece around what kind of behaviors are we actually trying to change? In most cases, statistically speaking, they're not radically innovative ideas that the participants are being exposed to, right? Like these are all things that we all know, right? Really, I mean, there may be, but it's the context, as Phil said, that makes it feel. It goes from I understand it to I actually care enough about this to want to change. And in the hands of good facilitators, it's that positioning in a new way that unlocks it in their head where they go, oh, actually, I thought I knew that, but I didn't quite get it until I heard it that way. So it's this content and context piece that are critical to getting people to a place of good intent. So Phil, I realize there's about 26 clicks in the next slide. So I don't know how we're going to point or something. I developed this model about 15 years ago called the Insight Action Flywheel. It's not particularly novel because there's very little new under the sun, but it refers to an individual's change experience. So for our purposes today, let's assume it's someone in a training session, but the same thing applies in a conversation or reading a book or whatever. We're exposed to new ideas and we learn how to change. Or to Lindsay's point, more often than not, we're reminded that this is a thing that actually matters, right? In most cases, we're not learning that new, it's the reminder. So we get it at a head level. And then the second part to it is the context, which is where it moves from head to heart, right? Where we go, I understand how to do it, and I have a strong enough desire to want to do it. Okay, great. That's happening in the room and in the hands of facilitators like TLS. That's happening pretty consistently, right? Most people, most of the time, are getting to a place of caring. There's always Gary. Sorry if there's a Gary on this call, but there's always Gary. He's just, arms crossed, not interested. But aside from Gary, most people are leaning in. I don't know if there's a
Poor
Gary.
Gary.
Now, it's like, should I go? So, good. All right. So we've got content and context, and it's always Gary. And then the hope is that they will leave and put those ideas into practice, right? That they'll start making change happen. And if we truly want to realize change, that's what we do when we're inspired to do new. And then we want to lock that in through insight, right? Typically achieved through reflection. Pretty straightforward. We learn something, we care about it, we do something, we lock it in through reflection. If you can pull up the next, perfect. That diagonal line represents the typical split between what happens in the room to the right and what happens when they're not in the room to the left. And one of the challenges is that they're left to their own devices in many cases, re the action insight phase. And this is the hardest stuff. So I want to give you a couple tips on contextualization. Again, data-driven, what we've seen as particularly impactful. Then I want to talk about a transition point and then a little bit on the action phase as well as far as supporting that change. So the 3-to-1 ratio. We did a big study last year. We looked at about 60,000 commitments in the platform. This was globally representative. Australia was about 18% of the data set in there, and found that sessions that had a 3-to-1 ratio between context and content had almost double the level of follow through from participants. I'm going to unpack that. A 3-to-1 ratio of context to content means that roughly for every 10 minutes of talking or new content being shared, there was half an hour, at least, in some cases upwards of 50 minutes, 50, of reflection exercise, of discussion question, of journaling, of an opportunity for people to find their own context for that content. 10 minutes of content, half an hour of contextualization. It was stark and kind of mind-boggling. So that was the first piece that I've taken from this. And aside from sessions like this, which are a slightly different format, we really try to move towards that in everything now that we're doing. And I know, again, the TLS does a great job of this, of making sure there's enough space for people to find their own why. One of the biggest mistakes I've seen with context is, you ask the question, have you given participants opportunity to find context? Yeah, we told them why it matters. Right. The organization's context is not the same as the individual's context, obviously, but it happens, right? We get in there, it's like, here's why it matters to the organization, or here's why it matters to the CEO, or here's why it should matter. We want to ask, not tell. We've seen the power of appreciative inquiry in program design around inviting people to the conversation. I think particularly in this time of burnout and stress, people are just so overwhelmed with stop telling me, right? But if you give me time and space to have a conversation, people bloom like a desert flower with water. They do. It's amazing to watch half an hour of open discussion around a concept, and people are lit up about it because they feel like they've had the space to actually discuss. They feel like they can breathe. And then the last piece in context, there can be a helpful focus on now and then. So this is getting now super practical. Many of you are designers who have all sorts of exercises. But if you're stuck on how do I contextualize this idea, is really simple. What does it look like now in regards to this? What would it look like in an ideal world? And give them an opportunity to map that out and then have a discussion around ideal world, what's practical, but there's an opportunity to contextualize that. Phil, I know you've got tons in here. Do you want to add anything at this point on that?
No, I think you've summarized it really well. Yeah, that's great.
Perfect. Okay, so the last thing that I want, or second to last thing I want to talk about on here was the moment at which we make the commitment to change. So when are we actually starting the change process? In other words, most training sessions, we make statements in the room, usually grand sweeping statements of intent, and then we leave. That's what the star is, where most people are now actually starting the action after they've left the session. But if you click it again, that's the extent of my animation skills in PowerPoint right there. In case you missed it, it's a one-time thing. It's over now.
I can't go backwards. That's it.
No, that's it. So you blink, you miss it. We've found that we go from about a 40% follow through on commitment up into the high 80% follow through on commitment when people are making the commitment to change in the room and actually taking the first step towards that change. What does first step look like? You can just put them all up, Phil, for the action. Yeah. So the first one is actually having something that I can do on a daily basis. Far too often commitments, let's say we're in a session on delegation skills and we learn something around delegation. We say, great, next time this thing happens, I'm going to do this new thing. That's my commitment to change. The problem is that that may not happen today or tomorrow or for 2 weeks or a month. This is one of the biggest challenges with DEI, right? We learn all these skills around what to do when we experience something that is inappropriate. And then hopefully it's not a thing that we get to practice on a regular basis. So one of the keys in establishing behavior change that moves the needle on the KPIs that matter to the org is to shift the commitment from something that happens as an exception to something that happens daily. So if the idea with, let's say let me give you a real practical example. Okay. I'm making a commitment to be a better listener in my staff meetings. Monday staff meetings, I talk a lot. So shocking, I know. And so my commitment is I'm going to be a better listener in those sessions. Instead of that though, which is a Monday thing, and today's Wednesday in Canada, and it's not going to be 5 days, and then I'll forget between now and Monday, and I won't know how to do it, and I'll try it once and it'll fail. We want to shift it into something that's a daily practice. A daily practice version of that might be when I'm interacting with a colleague, instead of leading with my opinion, I will ask one clarifying question, as an example. It's something that can be applied in the Monday sales meeting or staff meeting, but it's also something that I can practice on a regular basis. And it's through that regular practice that I start to build the reps, right? I start to develop the muscle of that new skill. I also need to reflect. So the self-reflection piece is key. Journaling, having an opportunity to self-rate, and then accountability partners at about 25% higher likelihood that people will follow through on their change just by having someone who's aware of their commitment. Whew, lots of talking in there. In the chat, what's most useful through that piece? Was it appreciating the content context ratio? Was it around the fact that we're starting the reflection process in the room? 3-to-1 ratio, yeah. Daily practice, context, too many words can kill it. Yeah, don't tell them why it matters, ask them why it matters. Huge. Daily practice, the examples of daily practice, self-reflection. Nice. 3-to-1, finding their why. Yep. We even found on the finding their why, in the habit builder, people are given an opportunity to write why the commitment matters to them. Commitments that had a why of 10 or more words were, again, like double-digit more impactful than shorter answers to that. People, the more they thought about why it mattered, the greater the likelihood of change.
Chris, I'm just picking up a question there by Lindsay. Do you have any data on setting actions before the learning event, then refining it during learning?
Lindsay, we need to have a long coffee. The short version of that, the most effective, so yes and yes and yes. The most effective is at the beginning of the session to prime the group with the reminder that, hey, we're going to learn some stuff, we're going to have fun, but if we don't do anything with it, this is going to be kind of a waste of time from a value to you, and everyone's very busy. People go, oh, right. So you say, so I'm going to encourage you and challenge you at the end to make a commitment to actually practicing something. Then at the midpoint, before the second half of content, to say, hey, remember we were going to do this thing? Let's assume right now we were done. What's the thing that most resonated with you that you want to put into practice? Let's shape it as a good commitment structure and then tell someone about it. And then at the end to do it again. So yes, it's powerful to be refining as you go. We found that the most effective is in the session, beginning, middle, end in that regard, and then lock it in at the end. Awesome.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. And
Yeah.
to Lindsay's question, so thanks, Lindsay. That's a perfect segue to what I was going to talk about, which is we're just going to step back a moment and take it out of the room, if you like, and think about, well, what are the things we need to think about before the event, or let's call it a workshop, during and after. And the $64,000 question is woefully wrong. Why I've been a little cheeky with that question is that most of the time we ask only one question, which is after, how do we make learning stick? But we like to think about it in a much more macro way, which includes, beforehand. And that, I guess, comes to your point, Lindsay, about, well, what do we do? I really love excuse me, some people on this call know that I've really been enjoying a book called The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker. And she speaks to this, directly, that the event actually begins as soon as the people learn about it. And so our communication is important, what we do, how we do it, whether it's by email or voice or briefing. And so how do we leverage that lead up period and make it the best experience possible? So we're really priming people for change before we've actually, formally started the program as such. And we've all, pre-work, reflection, etc., but been very intentional about, what is that pre-work? What is the reflection? What are we actually asking people to do prior to that happening? So, for example, we often will brief, or usually we'll brief one-up managers and have a call with one-up managers of the participants. We set expectations, we get their expectations. We tell people that you should feel like you're almost part of this program. That's how invested you should be in it. Please don't be one of those managers who, at the end of a 6-month program or something, say, oh, how was it? You need to be able to help them apply it almost on a daily basis in your normal kind of coaching, mentoring, and managerial function. So, and the disputable purpose is how do we move from boring and bland to something that actually has a bit of an edge to it. It kind of gets people's attention and is very, very focused. And then generous exclusion, like who should be there, who shouldn't be there, who's going to contribute to the disputable purpose and who may dilute it, and making some hard calls around that as we proceed. Then during, so linking learning to what matters, which Chris has been talking about. And that's back to the, the content and the context, strategic priorities. How do we make it relevant for their role? And I really love a quote that I've been quoting for many, many years now, and I even quoted it yesterday, go in their door and take them out ours. And what I mean by that is understand their reality, understand their context, understand their challenges and opportunities and their pain points and all of those kinds of things, and help them navigate through that to a place which is hopefully much brighter for them and much more, a place of optimism, using multiple lenses. So we see learning programs that are stuck kind of in the technical or the personal / psychological. How do we move to a different place, which is also about, helping people understand systems and move more broadly. I love to de-emphasize the gold medal. I invited three Hockeyroos, so the women's hockey Olympic gold medal winning team, to a workshop many, many years ago. And they said something which really struck a chord with me and the group. They said, at the time we were the world champions, we were unbeatable. We focused very heavily on winning. They had a complete shift in mindset where they focused on the process and the systems, and they took their eye off what winning meant. Because when you think about winning, or result is a lag indicator of all the processes and systems and practice that we put in place. And they focused on that, not the gold medal. And they started beating teams by even more. They went, 5-0, 6-1, which is, for those who know about hockey, not ice hockey, by the way, Chris, this is real hockey. This played on grass or turf. But anyway, so yeah, de-emphasizing the gold medal, I think, is really important. Cycle between vertical and horizontal, meaning we often underestimate the challenge and the polarity between what a manager has to navigate in terms of their own functional responsibility, but also the team that they sit in. And we kind of just say, be a team player, work at the horizontal, but it's actually both. It's an and that's quite a shift for many people. And then finally, what do we do afterwards? How do we help remove blockages? How do we create learning scaffolding, which is things like, creating habits and practices? We have an online portal, for example. There's a whole range of things. We're working with a government entity in Canberra. We're coming back in 3 months' time to say, okay, what's happened? Let's get real about the challenges and opportunities in you translating the learning to real world application in your role. And that also helps us learn, well, what can we do better in the during phase to help people make it real and tangible. And then simply, using multiple sources of influence and support. So, accountability buddies, some of the things that Chris mentioned. And then finally, making the abnormal normal. And what we mean by that is, one of the things our facilitators and consultants are used to saying quite regularly is, you can do this without me standing in front of the room. You can have a hard conversation. Don't wait for the facilitator to be standing there. How do we normalize learning to, really embed it and make it normal? So I might just pause there. I'd love to, any questions or feedback, what parts there might maybe resonate with you as something that you could implement, whether you're a consultant, HR practitioner, manager, CEO.
While folks are jotting some of those in, I went digging your comment here about the engaging the leaders at the top. We found that, this is from a couple of years ago now, but there was a 12% improvement in participants sticking with their behavior change and seeing a positive change when their manager checked in with them once to talk about that.
Yeah.
Versus not. Right? Like, we're not asking them to dedicate massive resources here. We just want them to be aware and interested in the development of their people. And if they can show up visibly for their team, you can expect double-digit improvement in the follow-through.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts in the chat on before, during, and after? Some of these look like common sense, but let's be honest, a lot of them aren't common practice. So I guess we're just making sure that, we talk about them. Okay.
Hi, Phil. It's Jill here.
Yeah. Oh, hey, Jill.
I think the after is something that's the challenge, and so sort of thinking about, you know, what other kind of blockages you can remove. If I think about how we structure our learning and development programs, it's always around the time that people spend in the room, and so maybe part of the after is also having something that makes it visible for people to sort of say, oh, there's some learning and development sessions, but they're free sessions, in terms of giving people the ability to go into something, to think about what they've been doing, to think about what learning journey they're on, so that they've got time at work to also be doing the after.
100%. Thanks, Jill. And I also like the notion of how do we align that to natural development stages or phases in people's career as well. So it becomes just-in-time learning versus, hey, we're kind of doing that level development, and how do we, kind of create that opportunity for people when it's most relevant as well.
Yep. Yeah, and some of that normalization can happen in the session as well, right? We sadly she's passed, but a colleague of Phil and I, Mandy Holloway, used to have this expression when she'd be working with these groups and they'd be talking about their commitments to behavior change. And she would say, how many days a week should we work on this? And they'd say, oh, twice a week, 3 times a week, once a week, whatever. And she would, as only Mandy could, would say, oh, interesting. So we're only interested in being better leaders 3 times a week. Is that what I'm hearing? And again, insert your own personality. But there's an interesting opportunity to have the conversation in the room around what normal looks like as far as practicing these behaviors. And with a couple strategic nudges, you can get them to a place of, oh no, of course, these are behaviors. They're not tasks. We should be living these every day, and really shift the expectation going out of the session too.
Excellent. Yeah, that probably should be in the during. We probably use that more in the during than the after phase. So it's a great point, Chris.
I think, yeah, it definitely fits both though, right? Because it's that uncomfortable spot, that conscious incompetence of trying the new thing. But if we're all doing it, then, it's okay, right? Or becomes more okay.
Yeah. So social learning is important too.
Chris, it's Daniel here. Just an extension on that. Yeah, and this is probably relevant in my mind at the moment because we've got Lauren and Richard on this call at the moment from the Leadership Sphere. But they did a learning session with my team last year, and it was what I'm seeing now was the surprising part. So we were having a real challenge around prioritization, and it was this concept that at the time I was having a bit of a giggle, thinking, "Is this really going to work?" Talking about the frog in the room and like one of these big ticket items that you continue to push to the side. What I'm seeing now, like 6 to 12 months on, is we keep it alive through various means, but it's actually the team that's now keeping it alive, peer to peer. So through team celebration, I'm seeing the occasional gamification of a frog appear on our team's chat, and I go, oh, it's still alive. And the best part was when I've got team members that were not even part of that session that have started since on board with this concept.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it becomes part of the culture. That's awesome. Imagine that, TLS doing impactful work. Well, your team doing the impactful work there, but that's beautiful. All right, let's do a quick overview because I want to show how sort of some of these things slot in. So if you can go to the next, perfect. So this is how the actionable, the habit builder tech works. And again, this is whether you want to explore actionable is not the point. It's how these pieces get strategically layered in. And so I'd encourage you, as I'm running through this, to sort of think through what could you insert into your own programs or sessions, or what's appropriate and what's not. So in the learning session before they leave, participants are making a commitment to a well-structured commitment to behavior change. So when this happens, instead of this thing, I'm going to do this thing. There's lots of great books on that, but that's the high level focus. Then as a group, they talk about what does good look like as far as frequency of reflection, of check-in. They build accountability partnerships in the room. The managers may be made aware, and then they leave the session. In the weeks following the session, they're prompted in one part by tech to say, hey, Dan, you said this thing was important to you. How's it going today? Dan shows how often he gets those nudges. There's a sense of autonomy, right? This is not homework. I think when it slips into here's the tasks for you to do to practice this behavior, it falls apart. But when I've been given the opportunity to say what matters to me and how much does it matter and what does it look like for me to practice that and when should I practice it, I've got a rising level of agency that increases the likelihood that I'll stick with it. And so we want to set up, or want them to set up, nudges or notifications, reflection prompts on a schedule that makes sense for them and their commitments. have their accountability partner check in with them, have the facilitator or host check in with them from the session, can be quite powerful. And then their manager as well. And then the biggest lift we've seen added in the last year and a half is most of the consultants we work with have started adding this closing the loop section. You can't see me, but the last piece there, the closing the loop section, where they get the participants back together. And yes, it's facilitated, but it's not new content. The whole point of the session, it might just be 20 minutes. It could be on Zoom. It can be very low labor, is to basically show the data to say, here's the behavior change that's taken place as a group. What went well? What were the challenges? What are we going to do differently moving forward? There's such richness in that experience. One, by knowing that it's coming, I'm more likely to stick with my commitment because of the sort of social component. And two, there's this sort of capstone event where people are like, holy cow, look at the progress we made that we may not have been aware of had we not taken the time to reflect on the journey since that session. So most of the things that I rattled through there, thankfully are in alignment with Phil's slide. And secondly, you can do a lot of these things on your own if you're designing programs. It's you know, strategically, where do you slot them in? Did we want to show them the habit builder? Do you want to give them a chance to play?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So just as a recap, and again, if you want to see how this works in our universe, participants choose a habit based on the session they just experienced. The habit that they're going to work on is a commitment to behavior. Richard, I love that you're jumping in there. Yes, I will get that in one sec. They choose something that matters to them. They choose how often and when and how they get the nudges to reflect, and then they reflect. They self-rate. How do I feel I'm trending? Red, yellow, green, 1 to 10. And I can add a journal. And then they can see their own progress over time. And the whole idea with the visibility on it for themselves, it's self-reported data, right? This is not empirical. We're not going to hang our hat on this as being, look at this, but it gives them a sense of progress and visibility. It removes the recency bias. And that's the key focus for that. To answer your question, Richard, the way that our platform is set up, it maxes at 45 days for a single commitment. We have seen that there can be quite steep drop off after that 45 days. And so it's being able to keep it tight to that focus. What a lot of folks will do if they have more than 60 days between sessions or more than 45 is they'll insert that 20-minute, half hour, 1 hour touch point where it's not new content, but you've got the session. And then 30 days later, there's the touch point where they can make a new commitment based on the same content or double down on the same commitment if they so choose.
And this is not a setup, but there's my live one that I'm doing right at the moment, Chris.
There you go.
So I gave myself a 5 this morning. For gratitude, I forgot to do my gratitude thing, so I got a 5. So shall we give people a little experience? And again, this is not about Actionable as a company, but why wouldn't we leverage the research and give us an experience of what it could feel like? Yeah.
For sure. Yes, if you want to put up that QR code. So for anyone that wants to follow along, you can scan this on your phone. It's just it's a demo. You're not going to put in any information or details. You can just see what it looks like on a phone. And I'm going to share my screen. Well, I'll give you a second to scan that if you're going to scan it. Everybody got good? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay.
Looks like we're good to go.
Good. So what you're seeing probably is something that looks like this. So if we think back, if you can picture my 4 circles of the impact value chain, strategic priorities, competencies, behaviors, content, the behavioral themes that we're focused on in the session are going to be different, obviously, for every session. So what you see in these blue bars was customized for this session. And so would the color palette, but that's not the point. What's important in here is the structure of this commitment. This is Charles Duhigg sort of popularized this. Michael Bungay-Stanier, who wrote a book called The Coaching Habit, if you're familiar with it, in it talks about the new habit formula, which is this formula: when instead of I will. We can, if there's time at the end, I can get into some of the science around that. But basically, there's a trigger, there's the current habit, there's a new habit. And so we're going to pick one of those. And the participants would do the same. They would pick usually based on the theme to say, of the 3 topics we covered, purpose in this example was most resonant with me. And then they're going to modify it. And this is where, and Phil was talking about this too, right? That at a macro level, we've got a strategic plan. It's pretty tough to go from strategic plan down to tactical change for the marketing manager in the satellite branch on a Tuesday, right? For someone to do that linking. We don't need someone to do that all the way through. We need a series of people. So if the designer of the program is identifying the behavior change in conjunction with the business leads to say, these are the behaviors we need to change because it should move the needle on these metrics, then the individual participant gets to determine the relevance of that commitment and modify it to make it their own. One of my favorite books of all time is Drive by Dan Pink, where he talks about intrinsic motivation. And it's heavily woven into the technology. That sense of autonomy, choice, the sense of mastery that I get from rating my progress over time, and the sense of purpose by connecting to the why I chose this commitment in the first place. There's social supports built in, so they choose an accountability partner. Depending on the culture, you can turn on visibility so everyone in the group can see not the details, but the sort of themes of what everyone else is working on. And there's that autonomy piece again. AI is insanely powerful. And there's lots of great places that we leverage AI in Actionable. Determining when someone should receive their prompts is not one of them. And I can't see us, we actually did it 6 years ago. It was a fairly complex algorithm that drove that. We ripped it out, gave the choice back to participants, and surprise, surprise, engagement actually went up fairly substantially. People want choice. So this is how we do that in here. When, how often. They get a text or an email or Slack, if you're on Slack. And it's designed to be the pattern interrupt, right? The point of a text is to say something new happened. Wait, but something's supposed to be different. And then they click it and it reminds them what's supposed to be different based on the thing that matters to them. And then they're going to rate their progress. How do I feel I'm doing with that commitment? And add a note as to why, a journal. So what they have then is that map of progress, right? Because Phil was a 5 today on his gratitude. And so it could be that Phil's Phil, he's a superhuman, but a lot of other people could go, I don't know, it's not working, I can't do it, right? Or it just sort of slips from memory. But instead, Phil does it again tomorrow because he gets the ping again and he goes from a 5 to a 7. And then he's able to look back and go, look at this progress that I've made over time. Or he can scroll back through his action to see his journals to say, when I had that 8, oh yeah, I did that thing differently. It's removing that recency bias. It's giving them a sense of progress. It's enabling them to reflect and learn. Think back to the circle. All of my models are just circles. But if it's the the content, context, action, insight, the insight piece is the regular reflection that the individual is having. Are there any questions about that? More about the science than the tech, but I'm happy to answer anything in there. Is there anything we want to talk through? Oh, Sarah's experienced it. Awesome.
And also, if anyone would like to know a little bit more, I'm happy to do a wee plug for you, Chris. And I think more about using Actionable as part of your learning or development interventions, please reach out to myself or Victoria after this and we can talk you through that a little bit more as well. So, and it linked to into managers and leaders.
Yeah. Yeah, so that, Lindsay, that's the piece that I'm actually most bullish on right now. It can, and it has for years. It's been the most underutilized part of the platform, and I think that's a shame because we do see that when it is used, when we identify the managers of those individuals ahead of time, 2 really powerful things happen. One, yes, the manager can see their people. And particularly if you have a manager that has been recently trained, where the manager is going, I know I should be more coach-like, but I don't. It's like double Dutch. Like, how do I jump into this, right? In a natural way. This is a really easy lift for them because they can pull up their team and go, oh, it looks like Sarah's working on X. I can go ask Sarah how she's doing. So yes, it strengthens the relationship between the manager and the team. The other thing that I really like about it though, is in particular for you senior folk, you can see then by team which leaders are engaging with their people on the commitments that those leaders are making and the impact that that's having on the behavioral shifts. So even though the managers weren't even in the program, you've got an interesting sight line to their sort of leadership prowess or efficacy in engaging their people. Yeah.
It's extraordinarily powerful. And from a consultant perspective, Chris, that also enables us to do evidence-based design, right? And to be able to shift things as we go along, which you might cover off a little more shortly. But
yeah, you know what I'm thinking? Why don't we skip the conversations piece so we can come back to it? And because that's a really good transition, we can jump straight to the insights part. Does that work for you?
Yeah.
Cool. Because this is the question, right? So what? We've been talking about self-reported behavior change, which is good. And I think, again, we're in the right group here where we all care about this. And let's be the most sort of caricature nature of a CFO looking at this, right? Going, so what? People are happily changing behaviors, but where's the impact? So perfect. So there's a couple pieces that bridge the gap between self-reported behavior change and the level 4, level 5 of Kirkpatrick around business impact and financial ROI. What we need to do is we need to marry individual behavior change to the KPIs as they're currently measured that we believe those behaviors should shift. So things like absenteeism, productivity, safety on site, excuse me, potentially performance review scores, whatever metrics are being measured already and how they're being measured. So we talk a lot about data clustering. I'll go back to the casino example. So if you recall, travel back with me, folks. There's 176 frontline leaders that were going through this development program, and they had a serious retention problem. It was costing them about $6 million a year more than industry norms said it should in turnover and replacement and lost time on floor. The 176 managers were on one of 3 shifts. It's a casino, 24-hour operation. There was the AM, PM, and the graveyard shift. A chunk of them were food and beverage, a chunk of them were gaming. What we did from a data share back is we didn't care what session they participated in. We didn't care what cohort they were a part of. We didn't care who the facilitator was. We did, but that came later. The data that was shared back with the executive team said, here are the leaders for the AM food and beverage shift, the AM gaming shift, etc. Here's the behavioral shifts that they've been working on and the month in which they were working on it. For the first 3 months, that's what we did. And in month 4, we showed the related KPIs to the behavioral shifts from 4 months ago. It was suddenly illuminating and remarkable to go, well, wait a second. What's happening with that group? They worked on these behaviors disproportionately to these other groups, these other clusters. And we can see it. It's right there in our own data that we've had an improved retention rate. And in their case, that retention rate it kicked in is about the 4 to 5 month mark. I honestly can't remember exactly, but it was about 4 to 5 months later that they saw a noticeable improvement in retention. Now, again, that's exciting, but it's a starting point. What it allowed the organization to do was to say, well, which behaviors were they working on? And why weren't the others working on that? And could we reposition those same behaviors in a way that makes the rest of the group want to engage in those behaviors? So that insight action flywheel allows it works on an individual level, but it also works on a program level where the insight that we derive can inform the next round of content, usually based on the behaviors that we want to shift. So what Actionable does from a measurement standpoint is we measure the impact, we measure adoption. So who made commitments to what, and impact, what did they believe the change is, the self-reported behavior change, so that we can package that and basically insert it into the client's KPI tracking so you can see one leading to the other where appropriate. Engagement is a piece for us on the learning side to be able to go back and to say, what can we do to drive greater levels of engagement? So the data is designed to serve the executive function in showing leading indicators around business impact. and for the learning practitioners to say, how do we get more juice out of this, right? How do we improve the efficacy of the program as we go? Phil, you know both sides of this. Is there anything you want me to unpack a little bit further or rewind on in there?
No, I just think from a consultant's perspective, the power of that can't be underestimated, right? So when we would normally present the data back to not only our sponsors, but also the participants, and say, we might do it 1, 2, 3 times during a longer term program. And it's extremely powerful to see them kind of light up or not and go, okay, so what else do we need to do? What else do you need to do to be able to shift the dial on this? So it's live. It kind of solves one of the big problems in terms of how do we track it and actually know that what we're doing is making a difference. I think that's so powerful.
Because it's contextualized to the language that the executive team is looking for, right? Yeah, awesome. Like the thing about, I do the comparison often to marketing. Marketing tracks lots of things, but let's talk about digital marketing. They've got click-through rates and impression duration on videos, etc. What the executive team cares about is the return on ad spend, right? And so everything else is just noise. We need to show return on ad spend. What's the return on ad spend version for L&D? And level 3 of Kirkpatrick, I believe, is the path.
Chris, is this a great question from Brian there? I don't know whether you can see it.
Yep. Oh, right. I'd love to see just a minute on how the behaviors are created. Is this bespoke, or are there selection drop-downs pre-filled kind of thing? So it's bespoke, Brian. The consultants that we work with have access to a library of themes, but it's really designed around, so there's a science, a formula to how to actually craft the statements. The themes are going to be filling the gap between the competencies we're trying to develop and the content that we want to run. So that, without knowing further context, I don't know if I can answer that, but I'm happy to dig deeper on it. Or if you're connected with the TLS group, definitely they can chat through that in more detail with you as well. You bet. Yeah, the platform is entirely content agnostic. That's one of the reasons why we partner with consulting firms, right? TLS has this brilliant IP to sort of pour into the container that is Actionable and driving that change. Where do you want to go, Phil? I know
I was about to ask you the same question. Did you want to go back to conversations or not? I think it's just worthwhile talking about cascading conversations, whether we use a slide or not. But why don't you kick it off and I'll jump in as well.
Sure. Let's take if you go back to 23. Okay. Cool. And please keep the questions coming in the chat if you'd like. One more back if you get that. Perfect. Okay.
Straight after this. So if you have got questions, drop them in the chat and we'll have a think about anything you want to ask for the final part of today's session. Thank you. Sorry, Chris.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. So people need either a reminder or new content. They need to care enough why. They need a system to put it into practice, and then they need some sort of reflection vehicle. This works great when you've got professional facilitators driving the content context piece. What happens when that's not feasible, either from a time constraint or a budget constraint? You need this to keep going. And I think, was it Dan that was talking about it earlier? We also, even if we could afford to keep bringing the facilitators in all the time, we want this to be embodied by the team, because that's how it gains legs in the culture, right? So how do we do that? There is no single vehicle that I've found to be more effective at contextualizing, helping people find their own context, than conversation. And so if you go to 24, we've taken that principle and run with it. And this is actually the longest running part of Actionable. Take half a step back. How do we sustain learning in most environments? It's usually, there's lots of different ways, but predominantly it's self-paced learning and or one-on-one coaching, right? Incredibly low cost and high scale, incredibly high cost and low scale. We want to put those two together where, yes, we want to share content with people afterwards, reinforcing a specific concept from the session. Most people lovingly bookmark that for later and then never come back to it. Right? Like, if we're honest with ourselves, most of our really well-designed content doesn't get consumed. We found that we can take it. The average LMS globally has a 12% utilization rate, right? 100 employees, 12 of them ever log into it, which is bananas to me, but another conversation. We can improve that up to about 72%. The 72 is made up. It's a low 70s number. I don't know exactly what it is, but from 12 to low 70s, simply by saying, hey, you're going to get together with your team and have a conversation about this content. I go, ah. And then now they go watch the thing, or at least pretend to, except for Gary. And so then they get into the conversation, and what's the conversation? The conversation is held by the manager, but the manager's not a facilitator, right? But they have held a meeting before, which is all this is. Actually, it's easier than a meeting because it's an agenda that says, hey, did everyone watch the thing? No, Gary didn't. All right, Sarah, can you explain to Gary what's in the video? Sarah says some stuff. Bill goes, well, I actually took something different. People start talking. It's very organic. Then we talk about the so what. There's no facilitator here. The CEO's not watching, to the best of our knowledge. Let's have a conversation about, do we even care? Why does this matter to us? And we invite that discourse in the structure of the conversation. Turns out most people do care. We see 88% of manager-led conversations, 88% of the people that are in those sessions go, huh, this mattered to me, and I want to do something different. And lo and behold, the habit builder is introduced at the end so that they can sustain the learning beyond. What this enables you to do is to bring in facilitators to work with the appropriate level of seniority from a budget and influence standpoint, and then to equip that level of seniority with the tools to cascade the learning back through the organization in a way that is consistent and visible. Because again, I know the idea of a meeting in a box for people to like train the trainer style is not a new concept. It's the visibility. You can see which leaders have scheduled the conversation and who showed up for the conversation and the impact that that had and what people watched beforehand and what they did afterwards, yada, yada, yada. And you can organize that, all of that by business function so that you can show by seniority, by geography, by function, by red hat, blue hat, back to the executive team what impact it's having.
And
Phil,
if I can add, Chris, massively scalable, right? Because you can then have thousands of people having cascading conversations, not with hands off the steering wheel for management or consultants, but massively scalable through large organizations, whether it be around strategy or and we're creating ownership as well, and being able to track behavior change as a result of that cascading conversation.
And you're right, it's not hands off, it's strategic intervention because you can see the bright spots and we want to go grab those and share them with the rest of the org. You can see the dark spots where we can go figure out what's going on and try to course correct. Just to put this in context, so our average deployment on this type of stuff is like 500 people. They're not, like, again, if you're thinking, well, we're not big enough, it's anywhere from 50 people to our largest was about 30,000 across 7 countries, 6 languages through Southeast Asia. About 14 different brands doing this full roll up from a cultural standpoint. There was one consultant driving that and one 25% PM that was supporting them on it. And they were running a 30,000 person culture change program through that complexity. So just to your point, Phil, around scale, that's the whole point with it, right? Limited resources in L&D. This is a way to actually make the impact you want.
And just one more comment too, the magic of turning learners into teachers can't be underestimated as well, right? So people love, they get the session plan, they love having these conversations and leading them. Yes, there's some anxiety around that. We worked with, even before we partnered with Actionable, but probably 10 years ago with local government, where we had a year-long program, 8 modules. I ran the first one, and then from modules 2 to 5, we ran a webinar. The learners became teachers, so they facilitated with myself, and then the last 2, I didn't even turn up. And so how do you empower and strengthen the system so that it's stronger when you walk away? And I think cascading conversations, is one way to do that brilliantly.
Yeah, Kylie points this out too, right? Imagine that also makes the team feel valued by the managers. And vice versa. Like I watched one of the earliest sessions I was witness to. There was a manager came out and he was like, he printed it out and his hands were shaking. He was reading off the page, and what was supposed to be an hour-long discussion went in about 18 minutes. And then he turned around and left. And I'm sitting in the back going, this is an unmitigated disaster. And one of the people sitting next to me leaned over and goes, that's the first time I've seen him out of his office in like 3 months. And someone else is like, it was amazing. Like he's showing up and showing vulnerability and going. And that's an extreme example. Again, most people have run a meeting before, so they can do this. And what we hear time and time and time and time again is that it's one of the most refreshing hours of their month. Because yes, it's a meeting, and yes, they're with colleagues, and yes, it's around work-related content. But the whole meeting is really being asked for their opinion and finding their shared alignment on this, right? Or where they're misaligned. That's a beautiful thing.
It's awesome, Chris. I'm just noticing, we're just about out of time, so I wonder if there's any
Shocking.
quick questions. Yeah. Lauren said just before we started, when you guys start talking, we're going to blow out the time, but we've barely got started really. So Lauren, I might hand it back to you just to do the final kind of wrap and see if there's any quick questions.
Sorry, Lauren.
It's all right. I've been watching the clock go down. I just put in the chat, I hate interrupting these conversations, right? So the joy I get and that we get to share of listening to these two talk about something they're so passionate about. So thank you, Chris, and thank you, Phil, for your insights and your time. I was going to pull a couple of key points out, but I am conscious we've got 3 minutes left. Has anybody else got a burning question? No.
I really appreciate the comments, the engagement. Shout out to Lindsay, my ride or die on this session. Sarah, testimonial, Brian Sands. This is great. Kylie from her phone, throwing out some.
Brian does have his hand up, so go, Brian.
How do I allow it?
Hi, Brian.
Look, I just probably have more of a comment, and just on that last slide where there was micro learning, I just wondered whether that I love this. This is awesome. But what worries me in an organizational context is the managers that we talk about have been stepped up into this role due to some operational capability. They've done a great job, some sort of performance. They haven't really been taught how to lead. I'm being general, right? And there's a lot of leaders as well that may not actually be great leaders. And on the basis that people often do what they see rather than what they're told, I guess what I'm trying to say, again, a general comment, it'd be great to get the leaders and the managers in all of this kind of micro learning, this kind of ecosystem of learning, because if we're just talking about the masses, which is a poor word, but the people, often these leaders at the top really aren't embedding that change or leading that change. So, sorry, there's a lot of words there, but I was making a bit of comment about leadership capability to drive this.
I think it builds off Phil. I've got two thoughts on it, and then Phil, I'd love to hear yours. But it builds off what Phil was saying a minute ago, which I've just forgotten. Sorry, I've totally just blanked. I hit 8:30 and my brain just like shut off. What piece number one? We want to move everything a little bit up and to the right. So Brian, to your point, some people are not going to be great at this. Some people are going to dominate the conversation. It's still going to be better than the meeting they had last week because it's a different approach that is more invitational to their team. So that's the whole idea, is incremental progress over time, right? I know what it was. The second thing was we engaged the leaders. They'll go watch the content because they're running a session now about the content. So even though the content was for their people, not for them, they're going to, in most cases, watch it, or at least pretend that they do, or pretend they did, in order to engage in that conversation.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, good. That's great.
All right, back to Lauren, I think. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks,
now, based on time, if anyone knows HBDI, my green quadrant is getting nervous about risk management and timekeeping. So thank you so much for joining us today. I am going to throw back to Chris and Phil. This will take about, I'm going to guess, 3 more minutes, if you've got 3 more minutes to stick with us. I wanted to check if you've got any final comments to share or something to wrap up the session with, to leave the group with. I'm going to leave you with one thing, is that the whole premise of this was about taking insights from a session and turning them into action. There's a group of very smart people sitting here in a room with us right now, and I would like to ask you what you are going to take from today and take action on. Was there an insight that you've seen, heard, felt? Are you going to change your design? Are you going to deliver differently? Are you going to go look at the 54% of your managers that might be overworked or close to burnout right now and have a check-in on them? Are you going to check if your CEO, 80% are not happy with implementation? Are you going to you're okay with the implementation on your strategy? Are you going to change context? So look, there was heaps of awesome content today, but Oh, awesome. They're coming through what you're going to do. So thank you. Think about that. And Chris, have you got any final thoughts or words of wisdom to leave the group with?
Thanks.
pressure.
I come into these sessions going, yeah, simple. We'll talk about this model, this model, this model. And I get into it and go, there's hours behind each one of these. And then I tend to speak more quickly. So thank you for sticking with my rate of speech there as I got more wound up. And it can feel daunting and or overwhelming, right? I fully get that. And, you know, some comments about lack of engagement from senior leaders, and it can feel like, there's so much to do to make this happen. And that's true. But you don't need all of it to start, right? To pick, as Lauren just said, to pick the one thing that you're going to do to move this forward. Maybe it's just the question of saying, hey, this program that I've been tasked with, I wonder what the upstream impact of that would be if you're on the lower end, or if you're designing a program to think, what are the changes we're trying to create with this, and how might we support that change? If you can just shift from the focus being on content to the focus being on change, and content being a catalyst for that change, you're moving aggressively in the right direction. Positively, what was the expression? Happily aggressive, Phil? Familiar? Kindly aggressive.
Aggressively helpful.
Aggressively helpful. Right. You're being aggressively helpful in moving from moving upstream, right? Getting into a place where your programs are driving change that's visible and measurable. So there you go.
Yeah, thank you. And Gary, the 3 to 1. I love that. That's going to impact the next. I don't do it very often, but if I facilitate 10 minutes of content, 30 minutes for people to actually get their own why. But
it's really hard, right? Like it requires you to get really clear on what's the change I'm trying to make and what's the least amount of content I need so people know how to make that change.
Beautiful. Thank you. And Phil, any final thoughts?
And I just want to say, Gary, we do love you because we do
Sorry,
have a Gary. For those who don't, Gary and I grew up together, so we've known each other since we were like 11, I think. But anyway, that's as an aside. So I'm going to have a stern word with you later, Chris Taylor.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, look, I'm going to take a different tack in terms of wrapping up just at the very macro level, which won't surprise some people. Leaders really drive business results. They drive social change. They drive the world we live in. So it's such an important area, and taking insight to action, I think solves, or at least makes progress on, it'd be a bit bold to say solves, but makes progress on one of the biggest L&D challenges we have. And that is taking things that we know or insights we have about ourselves or our organization or our families for that matter to action and making positive change in the world. And I was going to finish on a quote, and then I was reminded by Tony Robbins, who said, I love quotes, but in the end, knowledge has to be converted to action or it's worthless. That's it for me.
Wonderful.
Back to you, Lauren.
Thank you. Phil, thank you everybody for joining us. Have an amazing day. There will be an email this afternoon. Make sure you've private messaged Sarah if you can't take gifts. We've got some awesome prizes going out. Thank you for your engagement. Thank you for playing in this space. It is exciting, and it's a privilege to see you all here, work with you, and have a wonderful day and go and take some action. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Say hi on LinkedIn if you'd like. That's it.